Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today I've got a bit of a grail lens for you, the Sony G-Master 50mm f1.2. This is a really fast, obviously, really bougie 50mm lens. It is widely regarded as being quite good, just in general. And today we're going to find out if this lens is any good for astrophotography. This lens is a chunk. It's nice and heavy. It feels really well built. We've got a physical aperture ring, as you find on a lot of Sony's G-Master lenses. It's declickable if you need that. We've got two custom buttons here, an AF/MF switch, and besides kind of a loose feeling manual focus ring. That's what you got on the outside of this lens. The hood is a cylindrical type. It's rubberized on the lip there, and it's got a button to remove it. And under the 72mm filter thread, we have a concave front element that doesn't extend the whole diameter. This lens is pretty good. I mean, it's just all around considered to be one of the best 50mm f1.2s on the market today, if not, depending on how partisan you are, the best. I'm not concerned about that type of infighting. I'm concerned about how this lens performs on the sky, and that's what we're going to look at right now. Howdy folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we're looking at the Sony FE 50mm f1.2 G-Master. Very, very expensive, very fast lens, and fairly recent actually, although we'll see that I think I've got samples going back to 2022 here. So obviously I've been sitting on this for a while. That being said, most of these samples are from February 2024. So 6 months ago is when I'm recording this. And that's actually pretty speedy as far as me getting a review done. So yay! At any rate, I've got a bunch here. These boringer looking ones are the ones we're going to focus on primarily. And these were shot with the Sony A7R Mark V. 60 megapixel-ish sensor on that camera, dual gain sensor, so essentially two real, quote-unquote real ISO values, second of which is at 320. So these are analog amplification stages. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about a concept called ISO invariance, and this is the reason I shoot at this particular ISO value. Let me explain it. Basically, for this camera and for other cameras, not all cameras, but certain cameras, they will have two analog amplification stages. That's where you get an analog relationship between how bright the image is, how much amplification is done, and noise. However, because of the fact that they're relatively good at what they do and the current design modality, to get the other ISO values, the camera just fakes it by cranking the exposure more or less digitally. But it will lock that into the file, and that is your baseline in the file. So what does that mean? Well, if I shoot at ISO 320 or ISO 6400, I'm going to get the same noise performance. I'm going to get the same shadow detail, same image quality overall, except that at the lower ISO, I might retain some details, let's say, in bright nebula. Those are useful things to maintain some information in. Whereas if I crank this baby up to 6400, I might get pretty well exposed image on the back of the camera. But when I bring it into post, I might find that all my highlights are clipped and I have no way to bring them back. Thus, I have no information in those highlights. That's why I choose to, in the cases of these ISO invariant cameras, shoot at whatever their highest real ISO value is so that I can get the best of all worlds, essentially. So that's what's going on here. If you want to read more about that, link in the description will bring you back to ferventastronomy.com, where you can find a link to a wonderful article written by very smart people on the subject. You will also find information about the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II, which is the portable star tracker that I track these shots on. If it's of interest to you, you can find it on my website because Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. Go figure. You can also find a link to these samples. I may or may not include these fancier ones. Essentially, I'm making these available for your personal use for the purpose of assessing this lens's performance. Obviously, it's a very expensive lens. If you want to purchase it and you want to know what you're getting into, well, this is why I'm making this review for you. So download these samples, pixel peep, check the corners out, look all over the place. Make sure that you weigh your options, but please respect that even though some of these are underwhelming, they are my copyrighted works. So please don't distribute online or elsewhere. Please don't misrepresent them as your own, and please do not use these samples as a basis for your own review. Use them in good faith for the purpose I'm providing them, which is your personal evaluation of this equipment. All that out of the way, we will just jump right in here to the torture test sample. So 60-second tracked exposure, 60 megapixels, wide open at f1.2. Look in the navigator, it makes it easier to see the vignetting, which there is some. Nice to see that it looks fairly even, so I don't feel like the center of this particular lens is off to one side. It looks like it's pretty much dead on center and symmetrical, which is nice. There is, as is often the case, a bit of a brightening towards the center here, and if we swap over to the next aperture value, 1.3, to be honest, not noticing any difference. Even the histogram is barely changing. If we go to 1.4, there we go. At 1.4, we lose that bright spot in the middle. We get a little bit more of an even distribution around the edges here. We get a little bit more even exposure across the middle of the frame. That may or may not make or break anything. And in the case of that little bit of a brighter center, this might give us some true real exposure, but it also just might tone the contrast down a little bit. So we'll try and assess that. But at f1.2, let's jump into the center of the frame. And here in the center of the frame, I am happy to report there is no surprises. Mostly have pretty well-defined stars, tiny little bit of chromatic aberration or fringing here on some of the stars. Scroll down a little bit. Nothing really wonky, no spherical distortions, no big bloating, no real loss of contrast. Let's flip through a couple apertures here. This is 1.3, which is, I mean, it's almost identical. I'm not sure anything's actually happening in practicality. And 1.4. So 1.4, you're seeing there's the biggest difference. Things do look noticeably darker. And maybe this star here is being brought into a little bit higher contrast, but I don't think that that's necessarily a game-changing benefit. We scroll around, definitely we've got a hot and cold chromatic aberration on some of these stars. Luckily, that should be easy to fix. Ooh, galaxy. As we sort of pull our way to the edges here, we're starting to see that the star shapes are getting a little bit weirder, right? And this is still not coma. So let's look in the corner of the frame. This isn't coma either. And I know you're going, what are you talking about, man? Well, what you're witnessing here are different types of astigmatism. Coma, let's pop in here. Coma is what would happen if we have a star and it starts to get a fuzzy tail. It starts to maybe turn into a bit of a wedge shape and gets a fuzzy tail. And you'll notice all the stars around will all have the same kind of fuzzy tail, and they'll all either point in towards the center of the frame, which would be called internal coma, or all those little fuzzy tails would point towards the external frame, which is called external coma. And this is what coma is. Of course, not this. This isn't coma. There's, from what I can see, not really coma here, but that explanation tells you what coma is. And coma, or chromatic aberration, is named after coma from comets, because it can make stars look like little comets with little fuzzy tails. That is where the etymology of the word comes from. And in this case, we're not really seeing coma, but we are seeing tangential and sagittal astigmatism. So what is that? Well, it's the inability of the lens to focus all the light into a perfect point like it should, and instead it gets stretched out. So tangential gets stretched out along radius that come from radii that come from the center to the edge of the frame. So anywhere one of those infinite radii intersect with a star, you'll get a stretching along it. That's tangential astigmatism. Sagittal is the same general phenomena, but what happens is it comes in at a 90-degree angle to the tangent. So you will get that sort of wing shape happening a lot of the times. That's pretty classic astigmatism of the tangential and sagittal varieties. Sagittal will always tend to cross at a 90-degree angle, even if it has a bit of a curve or something to it. But the aggregate view is that it will tend to ring the center of the frame, whereas the tangential will radiate from or away from it, depending on your personal viewpoint here. So these little things here look like they're flying towards the center of the frame. That's two kinds of astigmatism, and it's not that bad, all things considered. When astigmatism or any other aberration tends to become a problem for me is when it starts to make the stars around the edges look weird or warped or stretched or too big compared to their companions throughout the rest of the frame. So if it becomes really distracting, then that can really be problematic in my view. Or if you're doing stacking and maybe you don't have really consistent framing from image to image, maybe if your object is here one image and here another image and here another image, what that can actually do is introduce a lot of these aberrations into the mix and make it really tough to stack. You might find yourself having to toss out a bunch of frames. So these are the things that not keep me up at night, but that make me, turn my nose up at a lens or raise my eyebrow a little bit. In this case, it's not really doing much across here, so I don't really see this as being a problem. And as far as astigmatism goes, if you've watched more than a few of the reviews that I put out, you can probably attest that some are real bad. Let's check out this one star though. So here you can see bright stars tend to be affected in more flamboyant ways. There's a lot going on here. And if they become an issue when viewed from a normal distance, I'd always suggest going in there and post and cleaning it up, maybe getting a different star from a different part of the frame or something and just cloning it out and fixing it up. But that's a personal choice. I'll leave it up to you. Some people get icky about that, but I'm not doing science, I'm making art. Here, classic astigmatism again. It's exactly what you would expect. All right, next I want to take a little look at field curvature, and field curvature is when the center of the frame is in focus, but the edges might fall out of focus in either towards or away from infinity. And that can happen in all different kinds of weird ways. You can have this part in focus, this part out of focus, and then the corners in focus, or you can just have a consistent loss of focus or kind of just a big drop off. In this case, we're looking at the stars, kind of compare them to the size of the cursor here. And if we come over here to the edge, while the astigmatism is making them bigger, they don't look especially out of focus. They do look bigger because they're getting mushed around by the astigmatism, but to my eye, they don't look like they're really getting out of focus. So I don't think field curvature is much of an issue with this lens. And I'm not surprised because it's not an inexpensive piece of kit. And it's also quite innovative. Like, I haven't seen too many lenses, at least in modern times, with a convex lens element in the front. So I think they put a lot of effort into making this lens good. And I think it shows. So here at 1.2, overall, pretty clean. 1.3, I'm super surprised by, like, there's a tiny, tiny loss of exposure, but hardly any. I don't get what's going on there. 1.4, it's a little bit more defined. It's what you would expect. You're getting more of a consistent exposure across the frame. 1.6, getting a bit darker. 1.8. F2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. Yeah, I went all the way to 2.8 for some reason. I don't know why. So in this case, that's getting really dark. I think the sweet spot here will be either 1.2 through 1.6, something like that, depending on your personal editing style and desires and what have you. Now that's just from a general exposure standpoint. Let's look in the center here, see what happens. 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Yeah, a little bit more contrast like we pointed out before. 1.6, you're not really getting rid of the fringing or anything, so I don't know that that's useful to go past here, but 1.8, F2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8, yeah. All right, here we are in the corners-ish. Let's get right up there. This is 1.2, 1.3, not a ton of, again, or any difference. 1.4, flick back and forth. 1.4, we're not really cleaning up the astigmatism. 1.6, 1.8, finally at 1.8, the sagittal starts to tuck in a little bit. Maybe the tangential is rectifying a tiny bit. F2, sagittal is basically gone, although that might just be because it's so dark. 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. We're just left with tangential astigmatism now. And again, I don't really think it's worth the hassle. Because here at even 1.2, to my eye, the stars in the edges and corners aren't getting that big. Let's pop over to the develop module and we will see what we can do with these chromatic aberrations. The automatic corrections take a little bit of the edge off, but not too much. come over here and grab some of this purple or blue. We can see that the stars clean up a bit. I believe this star is actually just supposed to be this color, so we're not gonna go clicking around there, but definitely that purple-blue fringing seems to have gone. Let's check the center. Ooh, now here is why you need to be a little bit careful. Even that amount of defringe has caused a bit of a cluster out here. I'll make it worse. All right, so this is how Lightroom actually deals with the fringe. It uses some counter colors here to balance them out, and it basically just puts a blotch over things. And depending on how much you can make that blotch, turn your image into an ugly checkerboard. So we really got to be careful. So here, at an amount of 3, it's causing issues. 2, it's still visible. 1, it's still visible to my eye. 0, take it all away. Let's try defringing again, but just on this star. Nope. Okay, I would say if you're gonna do this, if that little bit of a fringe mattered to you that much, you have to be really careful. Like, I don't know, it's not even fixing these, eh? Look back here at the center. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Here, now it's a little bit confusing. I know the amount of defringing is now at 20 and we're not experiencing those problems, but the hue has changed. So you can see here, when things were a little bit of an issue, the hue is much wider. So it's actually targeting some of the sky color. When we had a little more specific star to sample, even though the amount is all the way up there, the hue is much more restricted, and that led to a better outcome. Even the stars in the corners there are looking okay. So yeah, please keep that in mind. At any rate, let's flip on profile corrections. And already we can see there's a bit of a improvement in the vignetting, but not all the way. Now, for being such a fancy and quite, well, relatively large lens, that front element isn't the biggest. And there is a correlation between how big your front element is and how much vignetting you get. So here, profile correction is not cleaning all the vignetting out. You very likely are going to have to put a little bit more manual effort in, but we won't bother with that today. The other thing you can see is when we enable the profile correction is that we start with some slight pincushion or moderate pincushion distortion, and when we flip on this correction, it zooms in a little bit. Now, the corner-to-corner field of view looks like it's staying the same. If you watch these stars in the corner, they're not going anywhere, but we are losing a bit at the edges. See how some of those stars kind of jump off the frame and now they're out of your photo forever and out of your life? Well, we're losing a bit of field of view in the vertical and horizontal dimensions, which is to say, I mean, it's field of view we never really had because there would have been a distorted image here. So what's happening is there's a geometric transformation. We scale down, we can see what's going on. It's basically bowing out the top, bottom, and the sides. So we are cutting off a little bit of that, but we are maintaining that diagonal, which isn't the worst thing in the world as far as profile corrections. It's far from being a fisheye lens. So there is that going for us. But all in all, the only real disappointment about this profile correction for me is that the corner vignetting isn't getting cleared up a little bit more. It's like, it's noticeably dark. If it was a little more subtle, it would just kind of focus the viewer towards the center of the frame. But in this case, to me, I can come in here and fix it a little bit if I want, but it's just an added hassle, you know? That said, this lens is extremely clean across the frame. There's some, of course, always expected astigmatism and that type of stuff, but it doesn't really give too much of a warp look to the frame, and that makes me happy because this lens ain't cheap. So let's take one last quick peek here at our actual real world samples here. So here we have an image and here we have an image. This one's obviously a little bit more processed. This particular image I actually took with the A7R Mark II last summer, and my particular A7R Mark II is modified. So this is what the stock out of camera image looks like, and this is after a little bit of processing. And of course we can see we've got the Eagle and Omega Nebula, Lagoon, got Trifid in here, got a lot of nice detail, a little bit of mountain. I really would have loved it if I could have got this like a little bit more here, but unfortunately from my vantage point, this is where it ended up when it got to this sort of orientation. Probably a week or two too late to get it in the middle. But all in all, definitely nice and usable. This one was at f1.4 and 15-second exposures, untracked, I believe. It seems like it would be untracked. I did have a couple trackers out that night, but I can't quite remember what I was using them for. And I don't quite remember why I used 1.4. It could have been a goof on my part, or or it could have been a function of the fact that this particular camera has a non-standard filter arrangement. And especially with wider fast lenses, it can play a little bit of havoc with it. So if we come here to the corners, actually, they don't look that warpy, although they do look a little bit more out of focus. So I might have stopped down to try and get things a little more consistent, or I might have just goofed because the last lens I might have used on this camera was set at 1.4. Who knows? Anyway, that's why sometimes it's okay not to overthink things. Sometimes stuff just works out. ISO 640, because that's the second base ISO for this camera, which is a 42 megapixel camera. And if we go back in time even further to 2022, oi, that makes me feel weird. This is a 40-second tracked exposure wide open at f1.2 using the A7R Mark IV. And here we can see it's pretty consistent with what we were seeing. Got that astigmatism in the corners, right? And my A7R Mark IV, I should mention, is also astro modified, although I do have a white balance filter that I can add back into it to bring things back to stock value. So that's what was going on here. But yeah, in this case, I think I know where this is. I think the Crowfoot Glacier is right down here. I believe that's where I was that night. Hope you found this useful. Let's wrap it up outside of Lightroom and get you on your way. All right, 50mm f1.2. 50mm, that is a really good focal length for getting more of a tight in Milky Way core, that type of framing, where you can work in some foreground elements and kind of get up close and personal with the Milky Way. I think when you stretch things out to, let's say, 14mm or even 20 or what have you, you actually lose a lot of the fine detail and some of the imposingness or the majesty of the Milky Way because it gets stretched out across the frame. This type of focal length is going to let you get in really tight and still get that Milky Way-ish experience. 1.2, surprisingly usable. I think I am going to be fine using this lens at f1.2. Should you buy this lens specifically for astrophotography? I mean, it ain't cheap. I would not encourage you to do that personally unless you have the financial liquidity to do so. If you have this lens, do astrophotography with it. Why not? It's pretty compelling. If you have this lens and you're using it for other stuff, I'm sure you're having a great time. Definitely, like I said, this is a halo product. It's not something that everyone should run out and get. Whether or not you might want to use it for astrophotography, I really hope that this review helped you decide. Overall, I'm going to continue to use it. It is chunky. It's obviously a fantastic lens. I am incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to play around with this type of toy. I hope this has been informative for you. I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.